So welcome to episode 12 of the Philosopher Meets Critics session, organized by the Federal University of Bahia and Concept, the Cologne Center for Contemporary Epistemology and the Kantian Tradition. So episode 12, that means we have our one-year anniversary today. In the last 12 months, we invited various authors to present their books and get some food for thought by our critics. And today we are very happy to present Julia Staffel from the University of Colorado Boulder. And Julia is specialized on epistemology with a focus on formal epistemology. And among other things, her work is concerned on the question of how to make idealized formal models in epistemology accessible for human non-ideal thinkers. And today she will present her book Unsettled Thoughts, a theory of degrees of rationality, published by Oxford University Press in 2019. And I would also like to welcome our critics, Lisa Bastian from the University of Amsterdam, Ted Poston from the University of Alabama, and Liz Jackson from Ryerson University. Thank you all for taking your time, and I think you should start with Julia's presentation. So Julia, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Yes, okay, let me share my screen. All right, yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. And thank you very much to my critics for their great comments. I'm looking forward to discussing those. But first, I want to give you a little guided tour through the book. Here we go. Okay, so I want to start out by giving a little shout out to Glauber de Bona, my co-author from the University of Sao Paulo. A bunch of the work that was the basis initially for the book was done with him. We published 2 papers together, Why Be Approximately Coherent and Graded Incoherence for Accuracy Firsters, and those were really important in figuring out some of the main results for the book. So yeah, shout out to Glauber. Okay, so a question that people in epistemology are really interested in answering is what it takes for people to have ideally rational degrees of belief or credences. And a very popular answer that's given in what's often called the Bayesian framework is that your credences are ideally rational if they are representable as probabilities. And maybe there are some additional principles that they also need to obey, but that's like a very, very common answer. Now, here's a problem with that people run into relatively quickly once they start working on this, this theory, is that perfect compliance with these Bayesian norms is not attainable for human thinkers. Just because, you know, human thinkers are cognitively limited, we only have like so much time and so many resources in our brains to figure things out, and being perfectly probabilistic is just kind of beyond that. So that immediately raises the question in how far these norms even apply to human thinkers if we can't fully comply with them, right? If we can't ever really get there, maybe they don't even have any relevance for us. Now, the popular answer that's then given in response to that is that, well, even if you can't ever be fully ideally rational, if you're a human thinker, you should try to approximate ideal rationality as much as possible, even if full compliance is out of reach. But this is kind of as far as it often gets in how much this answer is spelled out. And I think that if we want to make this answer plausible and really, really explain why for human thinkers like us, it's good to try to be more ideal, even if we can't be fully ideal, in order to make that plausible, we have to answer 2 further questions. So the first question is, what does it actually mean to approximate having ideally rational credences more or less closely, right? This like initial answer seems to kind of presuppose that we actually know what that means, but I think it could mean a lot of things. It could even just be kind of a metaphor. So we need to think about that more. The other question that we need to answer is why it is actually better to be less irrational if you can't ever be fully rational, right? So why is it better to get closer if you can't get all the way there? So that's kind of those are my guiding questions for the book. And in Unsettled Thoughts, I give you some answers to those. And I'm going to walk you through now sort of the big picture of how I developed those answers. I want to tell you a little bit about why these questions are actually difficult to answer. So, so if we interpret question 1 about what it means to approximate ideal rationality as more than just a metaphor, we're landing in the field of mathematical distance measures. And there are a lot of distance measures. So you can Google for the Encyclopedia of Distances. It's about 500 pages or so. There are a lot of different distance measures we could use, and they don't agree on how to order credence functions according to how far away they are from the ideally rational credences. So there's just like so many options, and we have no idea what the right ones are. Basically, the strategy we have to pursue if we want to go this way of using mathematical distances is we do basically this. We first represent an agent's credences as a vector. And that's just a fancy way of saying you take all their credences in different propositions, you remember what the order is, which credence goes with which proposition, and then you just write them next to each other like so. Then you pick some distance measure that measures distance between vectors, and then you find another vector that would represent an ideally rational credence assignment to the same set of propositions, and that minimizes this distance between the two vectors according to that distance measure that you picked. And then the distance between those two vectors would be the degree to which the agent's credences are irrational, or the degree to which they approximate ideal rationality. Here's an example of how this would go. So suppose somebody has credence 0.4 in P and credence 0.3 in not P. This would be irrational or incoherent because they should sum up to 1, but they don't, right? So then here's how we would write them as a vector. And one distance measure we could pick is squared Euclidean distance. So the way this distance measure works is you take your two vectors, you calculate the difference between the first two numbers in those vectors and square it. And then you do the same thing for like the second two numbers, the third two numbers, and so on. You add that all up, and that is your squared Euclidean distance between the two vectors. Now, if we ask, well, what is the closest coherent credence assignment to P and not P according to this distance measure, we land on 0.55 and 0.45 here. And the distance between those two vectors is 0.045, right? So there's a sense in which there's a pretty straightforward way in which we can implement this idea that, you know, we can measure the distance of our credences from the ideal credences. But again, right, instead of using squared Euclidean distance, I could use many other distance measures, and they don't give me the same orderings necessarily of which credences are closer and further away from ideal rationality. So we need to know what's the right distance measure and why. The other question is, why is it better to be less irrational if you can't ever be fully rational? And this question is difficult to answer because not every time we approximate an ideal do we get increasing portions of the value. So first, think about an example where my ideal is that I want to get this great job of my dreams, right? Now, suppose, right, I'm interviewing for the job and they put out the ranking of candidates and I'm in 3rd place for the job. Now, there's a sense in which I am closer to getting my dream job than the person who's ranked 5th or 6th. But there's nothing I'm getting that, you know, I'm getting more of than the 5th place person. The dream job example is one of these winner takes all examples where if you kind of want the value and you get all of it when you hit the ideal, right, you get the dream job. But then anybody who doesn't, you know, achieve 1st place, they don't get any of those benefits that the person gets who is in 1st place, right? They don't even get like a portion of those benefits. It's just, you know, it's like all or nothing. Other cases are different. Like think about a case where my ideal is that I want to be fluent in Portuguese, right? Because say I want to talk to people in Portugal and in Brazil, and I want to watch Portuguese movies and read Portuguese literature in the original. And of course, I would best achieve that if I was fully fluent in Portuguese. But let's say that's just not really possible for me. Well, I can attain some amount of these benefits, right, as I increase my fluency, right? Even just getting better at Portuguese lets me have more sophisticated conversations with people, right? I'm increasingly able to understand movies that I'm watching and read newspapers and novels and things like that. So there, as I become more fluent, I have an increasing kind of benefit that's a portion of the benefit I get from being fully fluent. Now, in the rationality case, right, for us to get any benefit from approximating ideal rationality, even if we don't get all the way there, rationality would have to be more like the language example than the job example. But antecedently, we don't necessarily know which one it resembles more. So I think the best strategy for answering these questions is to take them together. And there's kind of a stepwise procedure, I think, that should sort of structure the way we try to approach this. I think the first step needs to be that we find a value that is best attained by being ideally rational, right? What do you get out of being perfect? The next step is to specify how this value could be attained in bigger and smaller portions, right? So how could you get more and less of this thing that you get the most of when you're ideally rational? And then the third step is to find some kind of distance measure out of all the distance measures that we could in principle use, such that approximating ideal rationality according to that distance measure actually delivers increasing portions of the value that we already identified, right? If we can do that, then we both have an answer to why is it good to be less irrational, even if we can't get all the way to the ideal, and we have an answer to how to pick out any sort of distance measure out of the big vast sea of distance measures we could in principle use. Okay. Now I want to give you a couple of case studies that show that the strategy actually works pretty well. Now, what should we say about step one? What values are attained by having probabilistic credences? And here we can look at the literature on justifications for probabilism. And the two really popular ones are that the value is accuracy, namely avoiding accuracy domination, and also that the value is that probabilistic credences are best at guiding our actions, and they avoid that we can be Dutch booked. And I'll say what that means in a second. Okay, so let's talk about accuracy first. There's this popular idea in epistemology that accuracy is the most fundamental epistemic end, right? That's what we're really going for. We want to have accurate credences. And then if there are any other epistemic norms, we need to justify those norms by showing that obeying those norms helps us be more accurate. Now, how do we measure accuracy? Well, the basic idea is that the most accurate credences are the ones that match the truth values, right? So if you're in a world in which it's raining, you should have credence 1 that it's raining. That would be the most accurate credence you could have. If it's not raining, give it credence 0. And then if you have intermediate credences, your inaccuracy is understood as the distance of your credence from the truth value in the relevant of the relevant proposition. And there's a big literature on how the best measures can be set up for a distance from truth. And generally it's thought that we should use a strictly proper scoring rule like the Breyer score. I'm not going to say too much more about strictly proper scoring rules, but just think of it as like a particularly suitable measure that helps us determine how far away your credences are from the truth. Now, once we have that, we can show that the probabilism norm can be supported because having probabilistic credences promotes being accurate. And the argument that shows that is called the accuracy dominance argument for probabilism. It shows that if you have incoherent credences, there is a coherent credence function that accuracy dominates your credences in the sense that it is more accurate than your credences, regardless of which possible world you're in. So regardless of what the truth is, there are credences that are more accurate than yours. However, if you have coherent credences, you are not accuracy dominated in this way. And we can look at this little diagram here to visualize this, to make it really clear. So imagine, right, you have these incoherent credences, 0.4, 0.3, that we had in the example before, right? So this would be this like black dot right here. Now, this red arrow stands for the distance from truth, from between your credences and the truth, if you're in a world in which it's raining. This red arrow down here would be the distance to the truth if the truth is that it's not raining in the actual world. Now notice that if you went to this credence function on this black line, where this black line actually marks up all the credences that you could have in P and not P that are coherent, so that's sum to 1. If you went here, automatically your distance to the truth would decrease regardless of whether it's raining or not, right? Because you can tell that this black line segment is shorter than this red arrow, and this, on the other side, this black line segment is also shorter than this red arrow, right? So there is a coherent credence function here such that no matter whether it's raining or not, right, your distance to the truth actually is shorter. Now, of course, once you are on this black line, right, there's no point you could move to that would get you closer to both ends, right? Like basically you're optimally close to the truth once you're coherent. So that's what the accuracy dominance argument shows. And of course, like the full theorem kind of scales up. It's not just applicable to these like simple cases, but it's applicable to full credence functions. Now we can adapt this argument to show that it's better to be closer to coherence, namely that moving directly towards the closest coherent credence function improves accuracy in all worlds. And you can see that actually from the same diagram, right? Because think about moving towards the closest coherent credences along this dashed line, right? You can see that as you move closer in this direction towards the coherent credences, you're always shortening your distance to both this end and this end as you go along, right? And so you sort of reach the optimal point once you're coherent, but just becoming closer to coherent gets you closer to the truth, regardless of what the truth is. So now, in order for that result to hold, we have to combine the right measures of accuracy and distance from coherence. But if we go for the Breyer score as our inaccuracy measure, and we go for Euclidean or squared Euclidean distance as our measure for distance from coherence, then we can vindicate this result that approximating coherence on this direct path is going to have accuracy benefits no matter what the actual world is. There are also other inaccuracy measures we can use, but we have to combine them with the appropriate distance measures to yield this result. So basically you can't just like mix and match accuracy and distance measures as you want, you have to use the right combinations. But that means we can actually produce some answers to our two questions, right? So we can identify distance measures such that directly approximating probabilistic coherence according to them makes you more accurate in every possible world, given a suitable accuracy measure, right? So there's a benefit that you get increasing portions of as you approximate coherence with this particular distance measure. Now let's look at the other value, attaining action guidance. So a very well-known result in the literature is that thinkers with incoherent credences can be Dutch booked. Well, what does that mean? Take our incoherent agent again. The idea is that your credences justify taking certain bets. For example, your credences in this case would justify selling me a $1 bet on P for 40 cents and selling me a $1 bet on not P for 30 cents. Now, I could buy these bets from you for 70 cents, so you would have 70 cents. But of course, one of the bets would win, so you would have to give me back $1 and you would be out of 30 cents. And this is general, right? Anytime you have incoherent credences, there's a betting scenario that we can set up where you would be guaranteed to lose money. And the idea is that having credences that justify betting like that is just irrational. Now, again, the idea is that maybe we can measure decreases in Dutch book vulnerability, so that the idea would be that as you become less incoherent, your Dutch book vulnerability decreases. For that to work, we have to actually standardize the size and the number of bets that are allowed. And if we do that, then we can measure with that standardized sort of betting scenario, how much money somebody would lose from a Dutch book. And the easiest way to do that is you just make all the bets have at most $1 stakes, like the amount that can be won or lost is at most $1. And for each credences, we allow at most one bet, right? So somebody can't just like make you bet on the same credence like over and over and over again, because then, you get results all over the place. Now, if we measure Dutch book vulnerability in this standardized way, then there is a distance measure we can use to measure approximations to coherence that track decreases in this kind of standardized Dutch book vulnerability. And this distance measure is just a very straightforward absolute distance measure that just looks at the absolute distance between vectors. And if we use that to measure how far away your credences are from some ideally rational credence functions or ideally coherent credence functions, then that tracks normalized Dutch book vulnerability as we just specified it. And on top of that, I was wondering about whether pursuing the value of action guidance and pursuing the value of accuracy, whether those could ever be in conflict or if we can pursue those at the same time. And it turns out that when a thinker approximates coherence in a way that increases her accuracy in every possible world, so like the first way, like I showed in the diagram, thereby she also reduces her standardized Dutch book loss. So anytime you're improving your accuracy in all worlds, your Dutch book loss also goes down. It doesn't hold for the opposite way. So it's not like every time your Dutch book vulnerability goes down, you also get more accuracy, but the one direction at least holds. So you don't have to like choose between them in a certain sense. Okay. So just to sum up where we've gotten right now, so it's possible to answer those two questions together, right? So we can use distance measures to determine how closely somebody's credences approximate ideal rationality, and which distance measures we should use depends on our conception of value, right? Getting closer to being rational should deliver increases in value. And I showed you how to do this for the coherence norm, but we can also extend this approach to views on which there are multiple norms of rationality, so not just coherence. Okay, what else happened? So this was about the first 5 chapters of the book. And then in the remaining chapters, I take up the following questions. I ask, what if there are multiple epistemic norms, not just coherence? That's the topic of chapter 6. In chapter 7, I talk about how incoherent agents should reason and update their credences. Then in chapter 8, I talk a bit about how my graded view of rationality fits into our larger theories of rationality. And then in the last chapter, I talk about the role of outright belief. And now I'm going to say a bit more about chapter 6 and chapter 9, because that's what the commentators are also going to think about later. Okay, so think about what other norms there might be other than coherence, right? So being coherent is great, but like that gives you like a very weak view of what is required to be rational. And most Bayesians think that there are other epistemic norms, such as the principle, which says that when you know what the objective chances are, you should match your credences to them. There's the indifference principle, which says that if you don't have any evidence, you should somehow adopt like a flat or indifferent credence distribution over symmetrical options. And maybe there are also some sort of evidentialist principles that say, what credences are appropriate to adopt in response to certain kinds of evidence. Now, how do we measure approximations to being rational when there's more than this one norm that we have to obey. Now, again, I'm starting from this value-based conception of rationality, and I distinguish between different views you could have about where these different rational norms come from, right? So you could be of the opinion that there's only a single value that matters that generates all the norms. So if you're like somebody who likes this accuracy framework I talked about earlier, you'll think that accuracy is the only value and any norms that there are come from accuracy. Then you could have a multi-value view in which you might think that there are multiple different epistemic values that the norms kind of help promote. And if you have that kind of view, then you could, again, have different kinds of views of how these values are related to each other. So you could think that they're sort of like equally important and comparable. You could think that they are lexically ordered, where like some of them are strictly more important than others. Or you could also think that they're incomparable, so that, you know, there's like, they might pull you in different directions, but it's like hard to sort of like, you know, find some sort of like all things considered judgment about, you know, what you should do to promote all of them. Now, I think then that once we know what our view is of how many different epistemic values there are, and how they lead to certain epistemic norms, that helps us determine what the best measuring strategy is of how we should measure approximations to ideal rationality. And I argue that for single value views like the accuracy view, you should pursue a bundle strategy for measuring approximations to ideal rationality. A bundle strategy goes like this. You find the set of credence functions that are permissible according to all the norms taken together, right? So you say, okay, what do all the norms say taken together are the ideally rational credences? And then you measure the distance between your credences and the closest permissible credence function. For views on which there are multiple epistemic values that give rise to different norms, I think it's more appropriate to use what I call the piecemeal strategy. And there you measure for each norm separately how closely your credences approximate compliance with that norm. And then you aggregate the measurements. And those strategies actually often give you different answers for, like, you know, how to best approximate ideal rationality. But I think that's okay. I want to be sort of like I want to give you kind of a choose your own adventure instruction here, because, you know, I don't want to prescribe what view of epistemic value people should have. I just want to say, you know, depending on what your view is, I can tell you what I think the best strategy is for your view to approximate, to measure approximations to ideal rationality. Then in chapter 9, I talk about the role of outright belief, because right in the beginning of the book, like, it's all about credences, but a lot of epistemologists think that people have outright beliefs. And the way I think about outright beliefs is that they are beliefs that don't encode uncertainty, right? So for example, my belief that I still have milk in my fridge, or my belief that today is Friday, those count as outright beliefs on my view. Whereas anything like, you know, a high confidence that today is Friday, or for example, a belief that it's probably Friday, right? Those encode uncertainty and they would count as credences on my view. Now, there's this question in the literature, which is sometimes called the Bayesian challenge, which asks, why do human thinkers have outright beliefs in addition to credences, right? Because you might think our credences are great, right? They're like really fine grained, they encode, you know, information in a really sort of like detailed way. Why have this additional set of attitudes that are more coarse grained? What does that do for us? Isn't that just redundant? And one answer that people have liked in the literature is that outright beliefs help simplify our reasoning. So here's the basic idea, right? In different contexts, you can treat different things as true or as uncertain, right? So for example, when I'm, you know, planning a dinner with my friends next week, I'm not going to worry about the possibility that I might be sick. I'm just going to treat it as true that I'll be healthy and that I'll be able to go through with those plans. But if 5 minutes later, I'm like, oh, I have to sign up for my health insurance again, right? In those contexts, I'm not going to just treat it as true that I'll be healthy, right? I'm going to treat it as merely likely that I'll be healthy. So different things can be treated as true or uncertain in different contexts. But then this raises the question how thinkers or their cognitive system manage the shifts between different contexts of reasoning, and how do they determine which credences and beliefs they should rely upon, right? So in one sense, right, it's good when you can treat a lot of things as true, because that reduces, your space of possibilities that you need to worry about, right? So the more things are treated as open possibilities, the more complicated your reasoning gets. So you can make it simpler by treating lots of things as true. But of course, at the same time, if you treat too many things as true, you might miss, things that are really important to pay attention to, right? So in the health insurance context, it would be a problem if I somehow had ruled out from consideration the small possibility that I might be seriously ill, because then I might forgo buying health insurance and be, in a lot of debt later. That would be bad. Okay, so thinkers have to then think about, or their cognitive systems have to settle, well, which claims should be treated as true? And then the question that I'm concerned with mostly in this chapter, once the set of live possibilities is determined, how should the remaining attitudes be readjusted, right? Because if you shrink down which possibilities you consider as live, that might also have to impact, how to adjust sort of your credences in those possibilities. Now, one proposal that has been made in the literature, which is, I think, really the only proposal in the literature for how this works, is that people pseudo-conditionalize. And pseudo-conditionalization works just like the general Bayesian norm of conditionalization, except that the agent doesn't really learn new information. Rather, what's happening is that she treats claims in which she has high confidence as true in a context, right? So say you're very confident in something, you treat it as true in a context for the purposes of reasoning, right? So you have an outright belief in it. And then you adjust your remaining credences in that context as if you had actually learned that Q is true. Now, the nice thing about this strategy is that pseudo-conditionalization ensures that if some possibilities are ruled out, the agent will update her remaining credences to reflect only what's relevant in the live possible worlds, right? It's like very clean, it's nice and coherent. It's like a very sort of clean picture of how shifting between beliefs and credences in different contexts works. Now, I argue, though, that when we look at evidence from complexity theory and also from psychology, we have good reason to think that this pseudo-conditionalization strategy is really way too complicated for humans to use. And so one must wonder then, well, how could it be true that thinkers use such a complicated method for managing beliefs and credences across contexts when the function of using beliefs is to simplify reasoning, right? Because it seems like if you have this super complicated strategy for keeping track of your beliefs and credences across contexts, that management eats up the benefits of, simplifying your reasoning tasks by treating certain things as true, right? It's sort of like, you might think like, why is that worth the effort? Now, you might think that pseudo-conditionalization is not supposed to be a description for how people actually manage their beliefs and credences across contexts, but it's like a norm, right? I've argued before that there can be norms that are ideal norms and we approximate them, and that's totally fine. So we don't have to worry about norms being a bit too demanding. But I think this is not a good response strategy when it comes to norms for belief. And here's why. We've said that the function of using beliefs and reasoning is to make it simpler, right? Now, this normative claim says that the proper way to use beliefs and reasoning is by managing them with pseudo-conditionalization. But I think those can't both be true, because if pseudo-conditionalization was the norm for managing beliefs, it would interfere with beliefs serving their function. I don't think that you can have norms for how to properly do something that interferes with the function of that thing, right? in order for something to be a norm for how to do something, it has to promote how to do that thing well, not hinder you from doing it well. So as a result, I think that the norm for managing beliefs must actually be different from pseudo-conditionalization. But then any strategy for managing beliefs and credences across contexts that diverges from pseudo-conditioning will at least sometimes introduce at least some synchronic or diachronic incoherence. But as I argue in chapter 9, that's actually okay, because when you disregard very small error probabilities in your management of your beliefs and credences, you're only going to introduce very small amounts of incoherence. And there, I argue, we actually see kind of a benefit of being incoherent, because you get this trade-off where you say, okay, I'm going to get a little bit of incoherence in my attitudes, but I'm going to be able to use beliefs in order to really simplify my reasoning. And that seems like a good trade-off. So this is sort of, I think, what's an interesting insight, that if we think that beliefs have this role of simplifying our reasoning, in order for them to be able to do that, they have to induce at least slight incoherence in our attitudes. But, right, slight incoherence is not so bad. We saw that because, we saw how, we get almost all the accuracy we get from being fully coherent if we're almost fully coherent. And we get almost a very little sort of Dutch bookability if we're almost fully coherent. So maybe that's okay to get like this kind of little loss in epistemic value if that makes our epistemic lives so much simpler. All right. And that's what I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julia. And I think we will continue with the first comment by Lisa Bastian. Please, Lisa, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Let me also share my slide with you. Let me first say start by thanking Julia for writing this book, because I found it incredibly helpful to clear up many sort of issues that have been floating around in my head about Bayesianism epistemology, and I think it's a great example of a very clear and rigorous book. So I was really glad to be able to engage with it again for this session. So here's a very brief summary of what the book is trying to do. I don't think I need to say much more about this because Julia has just told us again. So really what we're trying to do here is to find some resources within the Bayesian framework to have something to say about non-ideal thinkers, and to apply some of the frameworks and the tools to those non-ideal thinkers. And in particular, what we're trying to do, or what Julia is trying to do, is to find ways in which we can approximate ideal coherence. So how can we cash this idea out of getting closer to the ideal of coherence? And then eventually the hope is that we can also find some arguments to support the thought that more coherence or less incoherence is actually better. So it's better to be more coherent than less coherent. My comments are going to focus on two main topics. The first is the desiderata that Julia puts up for this way of measuring how close we get to the ideal of coherence. And then the second is to do with one of the arguments in favor of being coherent, namely the accuracy argument. So I'll start with the first one. Oops, sorry. There we go. Which is the desiderata. So in the book, Julia states these four desiderata that she thinks a distance measure has to meet if it's supposed to appropriately capture the way in which agents can get closer or be further away from this ideal of coherence. And I'm not going to discuss all of them. There's two in particular that I want to ask some questions about. So the first one that she puts up is to say that no matter which measure we choose, it should somehow be in line with our intuitive judgments about what's more or less coherent. So the thought here is that when we're confronted with two sets of credences, we have an intuitive initial reaction as to which one is more coherent and which one is less coherent. And that reaction, that intuitive judgment, should also be represented in the result that the distance measure gives that we settle for, at least ceteris paribus, right? So the thought seems to be that we can rely on our intuitions, at least in simple cases, to give us a good guide as to which of the two credence sets is more coherent. But the question I want to ask is, well, coherence is a very strange thing, right? It's a very theoretical construct. It's quite difficult to wrap our heads around. So is it maybe being a bit too optimistic that our intuitions could be such good guides, given that we're dealing with a fairly complex and fairly theoretical subject matter, even in simple cases. And so here's an example to illustrate what I meant. So this is from the book where Julia discusses qualitative distance measures. And so we have two agents here. I only put a sort of excerpt of their credences up on here. So they have beliefs about two propositions, A and not A. And we've got the first person that attributes credence 0.5 to A and credence 0.51 to not A. And then we've got the other agent who attributes the same credence of 0.9 to both A and not A. And now the claim is that intuitively we would all say C1 is more coherent. And I actually found myself not immediately jumping to that conclusion. And so I was sort of trying to think why that would be, what was the underlying reasoning for my intuition. And yeah, I think I was drawn to the idea that maybe they are actually both equally incoherent, because if we think about it, they violate the same kinds of coherence requirements and the same amount of coherence requirements. So if we conceive of coherence more as a sort of binary, as Julia was saying in the introduction, is more of a sort of getting the job or not getting the job kind of case, then maybe it's not immediately obvious that C1 actually is more coherent than C2. And I think this actually is still compatible with us also allowing for degrees of coherence, because you might still think when we compare different sets of credences, it will be a sort of binary decision between coherent and not coherent, but then we can still allow for degrees when we look at the sizes of credences that would qualify as coherent or incoherent. And so we could still have a way of talking about degrees there, even though we might be committed to a more binary picture. So yeah, that was my thought. And then I was trying to imagine, what would motivate the intuition that C1 is obviously more coherent than C2. And then I was thinking, okay, maybe this is related to the idea of how hard would it be for an agent to make themselves coherent given those credences. And then the first agent, it seems like they have less ground to cover because their credences add up to 1.1, which obviously is much closer to the coherent one, especially if you compare it to the second agent whose credences add up to 1.8, which is further away. But then still, I think it's not quite clear whether that's the correct way to think about bringing yourself closer to coherence or reconsidering your credences, because that seems to assume a sort of incremental picture of how this goes about, where we move ourselves from 1.8 to 1.7 to 1.6 all the way down to the coherent one. And it's not obvious to me that that's really how we should capture this process of reconsidering, of making ourselves more coherent, where it seems more like what we're doing is taking a step back, reconsidering our credences, and then reassigning them without having to go through this sort of incremental process. But be that as it may, I think the simple example, at least I think hopefully shows that maybe even in simple cases, our intuitions might just not be that reliable or might not be that good guides to what's more or less coherent, which then I think would question how much we should consider that as a desideratum for discarding some different distance measures and adopting others. All right, so that was the first desideratum. The other one I want to talk about is the fourth and final desideratum that Julia proposes for an adequate distance measure, and that's related to what she calls the inundation problem. And the thought here is that any distance measure that we choose should just not allow an unrepresentative sample of credences to skew the overall coherence value of the entire credence space. So regardless of which one we go for, it shouldn't be the case that we pick an unrepresentative sample and that somehow gives us the wrong impression of the coherence of the entire credence, of the set of credences that we look at. And then the question I want to ask here is of epistemic nature. So how can we decide, or how do we know whether a sample is representative or unrepresentative? So because what we're talking about here is coherence, it seems like a sample would be unrepresentative if its coherence is very different from the coherence of the entire credence space. But in order to know whether that's the case, we would already need to know the coherence status of the sample and also of the entire credence space. And it seems like that's precisely the thing we're trying to figure out by using the distance measures. And so I wasn't quite sure where the starting point would be here to decide whether any given distance measure allows for this, allows for any unrepresentative samples to skew the overall value. A little caveat here, I think the measure that Julia discusses here in her book is not so sensitive to this concern of mine, because it's one that uses only one data point to then infer something about the overall credence space. So I think with those distance measures, yeah, maybe we can still exclude them from the appropriate distance measures by appealing to this desideratum. But any other ones, that might rely on a smaller sample to infer a more general statement, for those, I think it's even more important that we have an idea of what unrepresentative means if we are to apply this desideratum and rely on it in our decision process. And the last question I had about the desiderata is really more of a question about why not include more? So why stop at 4? It seems like what's also really important when comparing and evaluating the different distance measures that are available to us, it does matter in how far they are able to lend support to two of the main arguments for being coherent, namely the thought that being more coherent leads to more accuracy, and being more coherent avoids being Dutch booked. And so in her discussion, I think Julia at various points refers back to that and sort of gives preference to distance measures that allow us to keep those arguments and vice versa. And so it seems like, functionally speaking, those lending support to those two arguments, they actually seem to play the role of desiderata already. And so I was wondering why they are not already included in the list of desiderata from the first place. And again, a little caveat or note here, I don't think this would stack the deck in favor of this argument for coherence. So that's one worry you might have. So you might think, well, if we include arguments for coherence in our desiderata, then obviously we're assuming that coherence is a good thing, which is the thing that we're trying to assess here. I don't think that's necessarily the case, even if we were to include those two points into our desiderata, because if we were then not able to find or a distance measure, only very few distance measures that met those then 6 desiderata, that could be reason to reconsider some of the desiderata, and that would still give us a way of questioning whether those two arguments are correct. So yeah, that's all I have to say about the first part, the desiderata. And then, like I said, the second area I want to address is the accuracy argument. And this might just be a sort of long-standing confusion on my part to really understand what accuracy is all about and how it relates to coherence. So maybe Julia can shed some light on this by replying to my questions. So the thought, generally speaking, here is that why do we even care about approximating coherence? Why is it good to be more coherent or to be closer to the ideal of coherence? Why would this be a good thing? One answer you can give is, well, because being more coherent leads to more accuracy, where that's understood as being closer to the truth, having a more accurate representation of the world. So the assumption is that accuracy and coherence go hand in hand. And then here's an example that is also taken from the book, where we again have two agents, and they have two credences about whether it's raining or not. The first person assigns 0.4 credence to it's raining and 0.3 to it's not raining. And then on the other side, we have a coherent agent that assigns 0.55 to it's raining and 0.45 to it's not raining. And then the argument is that C2, the coherent agent, is more coherent and also has a set of credences that accuracy dominates C1. So whenever you are more coherent, you'll have, or if you're not coherent, there will be a set of credences that will accuracy dominate your set of credences. And then we move from being more coherent to not being accuracy dominated, and that meaning that we're closer, our credences will be closer to the truth. So that is the thought behind appealing to accuracy as an argument in favor of being coherent. And so then I was thinking, well, what happens if we change the prepositions that these credences attach to, right? Because this is what we're concerned with here is the coherence. So that's just that's in a Bayesian framework understood as the probabilities, so the credences that are assigned to the prepositions. So what if we just swap them around? That should make a difference. And so I kept the, now we have the same credences within the two agents. So that would mean that C2 is still more coherent than C1. But then the question I want to ask here, and that maybe Julia can help me out with a little bit, is whether C2 is still closer to the truth. Because here it seems like our first person, or the second person, the more coherent person, attaches a higher probability to the proposition that unicorns exist than the first person, who is more incoherent, but presumably can still be accuracy dominated, if that line of reasoning is correct. The other more general example that people always bring up when we talk about coherence and truth is the example of a conspiracy theorist who's ideally often perfectly coherent, but the propositions that their credence is attached to is just made up only by falsehoods. So they have an entire set of false beliefs that's perfectly coherent. So again, that would be a case where you are perfectly coherent, but really far from the truth. I do want to say here that Julia does talk about cases in which the link between accuracy and coherence can actually break down. So she does acknowledge that that's not always the case. But I think there's a more general question we can ask here based on these observations, which is accuracy as it stands, or as I understood it, is more of a structural notion, that talks about the ways in which the credences can combine about mutually exclusive propositions. And what I was wondering is whether that's a rich enough notion to also make substantial statements about truth. So not just about the credences that attach to your propositions, but also what those propositions are and how we should evaluate them. And based on that general question, maybe there's an even more general question that we can ask that's even broader in scope, where given all of this, should we maybe think of coherence as a value that's not entirely epistemic, but maybe something else? And part of the reason why you might think that is that some of the arguments that are given for coherence might not be that epistemic in nature. So Dutch book arguments seem to be much more practical in nature, because they rely on practical consequences, good or bad. Accuracy seems to be somewhat limited in terms of its ability to talk about substantial statements about the truth or falsity of propositions. And even accuracy, even if we accept it as a epistemic notion, is also sometimes sold as being action guiding, right? Where the thought is, well, if the map of the world that we have in our head is better, is more accurate, then we'll be able to make better choices. So even that seems to be a bit of a practical concern here. So the general question would be, what kind of value is coherence, and is it really truly an epistemic value, or maybe something else, or maybe a mix of various other things that play a role here? All right, thank you very much.
Thanks, Lisa, for those great comments. Those really go to the heart of some of the things that the first 5 chapters are dealing with. So I have some slides prepared here, so I'm going to share my screen and kind of walk through some of what I have to say about this. First, I want to start by saying a little bit about the desiderata, right? So you said, okay, well, I claim that when we look at these two credence functions, right, C1 here that has credence a 0.5 and credence not a 0.51, that's intuitively more coherent than the one where we get 0.9 in A and not A. And why shouldn't we think that they're both equally incoherent, right? Because they violate the same amount of coherence requirements. So I think when we look at really simple examples like that, I think it makes sense to think about, what kinds of coherence requirements are violated and how many of them. But it turns out that once we try to look at sort of larger sets of credences, it actually becomes very unwieldy to try to figure out how many or which coherence requirements are violated, because they are just sort of intertwined, and sometimes sort of the same error could be like cast in various different ways as violating like one thing or another. And I mean, in general, I think that our intuitions about coherence do favor ranking methods that are sensitive to the numerical differences in credences. I don't want to say that this kind of like Zinder style ranking method that is sort of the alternative, where we say, maybe we can look at, what's the largest coherent subset of your credences or something like that. I don't think that's necessarily ruled out by our intuitions completely. I think there is a sense in which that is also a way of thinking about what's more coherent than what. But one thing that's interesting when we compare those is that sort of style of ranking credence functions according to how coherent they are actually doesn't happen to track any of the values we care about, right? So we can show that sort of method of ranking ultimately doesn't track like what's more accurate than what, or who's more Dutch bookable, right? So only the sort of numerically sensitive way of ranking tracks those values. Now, you might ask, right, why should our measures even match our intuitions about closeness to coherence, at least in simple cases, right? I think we don't have great intuitions about closeness to coherence in more complicated cases, but I think we do in simple cases. And I think that part of why our measures should match our intuitions is because, right, the question we started with was, is it actually beneficial to have credences that are closer to being rational, right? And that sort of presupposed that there's some sense in which, there's a meaningful way we can ask about closeness to being rational. And now imagine somebody came to you and gave you an answer that said, actually, yes, it is beneficial to have credences that are closer to being rational, but here's the measure of closeness that you have to use. And suppose that that's a measure where like, that does not look anything like what you could identify as closeness, right? Even in super simple cases, it seems to be like all over the place. And what it claims is close to coherence and what's closer than what, like you cannot recognize any intuitive sense in which that matches what you thought closeness meant. In that case, I'm not even sure anymore that we really have a yes answer to our initial question, right? Where the initial question was, is it beneficial to be closer to coherence? If the answer is yes, if we come up with like a super weird gerrymandered sort of notion of closeness, right? I think maybe then that's not really what we were looking for. So in that sense, I think it's, in order to really have a meaningful yes answer to our question, our sort of measures that we use as approximation measures should at least be in some sense recognizable as what we think closeness amounts to. You're also asking about the representativeness desideratum. And I totally see your concern there, right? Where like, when you're asking like, oh, is this subset that this measure is sort of latching onto actually representative of the whole credence function when we're measuring coherence? Don't we actually need to know already like what we mean by coherence and closeness and things like that, right? And I think you're totally right about that. And I don't think this representativeness desideratum is really like a good way to rule out measures where we have these cases where we're like actually not sure unless we already know what we mean by coherence and things like that, or by closeness to coherence. But I do think, and this is kind of really what I use it for, I do think sometimes we can see that a measure is clearly using an unrepresentative sample, right? And the one that I apply it to in the book is the Chebyshev measure that only looks at the worst subset of your credences, which really could be just one credence. So basically, just to give you an example, if you use the Chebyshev measure to measure degrees of incoherence, if you assign credence 1 to a contradiction or credence 0 to a tautology, that is basically the worst case scenario in this measure. And then it doesn't matter what exactly happens in the rest of your credence function, you're always going to be stuck at having the worst degree of incoherence as long as you make this error on this one credence. And that seems a very bad way of measuring the coherence of your entire credence function. But with this desideratum and also with all the other desiderata, they're not supposed to be able to like look at any measure you give me and sort of say definitely yes or definitely no. These are more like guidelines where like they help us rule out measures that are definitely not doing what we want, but there could also be a big sort of like gray area where we're like, well, we're not so sure if this measure does exactly what we want, so it's not clearly ruled out. But it just gives us sort of guidelines for what to look for in a measure that tracks, approximations between credence functions. That's kind of the idea behind it. So Lisa is also asking, why not add these two additional desiderata, like more coherence leads to more accuracy, more coherence avoids being Dutch booked. And I think it's because they're just about something slightly different, right? The desiderata that I was picking out were supposed to single out measures that could, in principle, track approximations to ideal credences, right? So they all had something to do with, like, what makes a measure look like an approximation measure that sort of, helps us single out measures that look something like what we meant by approximate. And they also have something to do with, like, what makes credence functions comparable and things like that. But I think that the two principles that are up on this slide, they're really about something different, right? They're about the value that coherence is supposed to help us attain, right? And there's this possibility that there are a bunch of measures that look like candidates for approximation measures, but they might not track any sort of value we're interested in. And so I just thought the question about what makes a measure like a plausible approximation measure, and what, is a value that we might want to, get out of approximating ideal rationality, I just thought those were sort of slightly different questions. But of course, in the end, right, we are kind of treating them together, because we are asking, which value do we get from approximating ideally coherent credences with this kind of measure, right? So the approximation measures ultimately have to track the value. So in that sense, they are sort of combined. Now, then there were these questions about, okay, what should we really make of these this accuracy project, where we think accuracy is this really important epistemic value, right? And so I think it's really worth thinking about the incoherent conspiracy theorist, right? So just by the nature of the accuracy dominance theorem, we can prove that even the incoherent conspiracy theorists could get a little bit more accurate by being coherent, right? Because remember that the accuracy dominance theorem shows, the one that we illustrated in that diagram, is that when you move to the closest coherent credence function from your incoherent credences, you become more accurate no matter what the world is like, right? So even if the incoherent conspiracy theorist has pretty inaccurate views about what the world is like, by becoming coherent in a specific way, the incoherent conspiracy theorist could gain a little bit of accuracy, right? But it's very important to note that the amount of accuracy you gain by becoming coherent might be just dwarfed by, how inaccurate you still are, just because you have like very poor views about the actual world, right? So while the incoherent conspiracy theorist can get a little bit more accurate by becoming coherent, right, that doesn't necessarily get that person very far towards the truth, right? So in a way, you might think, yeah, it's like kind of, helping you a little bit, but, maybe not by an amount that would like significantly help this person sort of improve their view of the world. And I think it's also a really important question whether this formal notion of accuracy, right, where we just measure the distance between your credences and the actual truth values of the propositions you have credences in at that world, does that really capture all the reasons for why we think truth is important? And I think that maybe not entirely, right? So one thing that has been pointed out is that this formal notion of accuracy is not very good at capturing verisimilitude, because verisimilitude to some extent has to pay attention to the content of our credences, right? So suppose that, I could have a lot of inaccurate credences, but they're very close to the accurate credences, right? So maybe I think I'm very confident that my keys are like on the left side of the table by the door, but they're actually more towards the middle, right? There I would have, in a way, a very inaccurate credence because I'm very far from the truth, but I'm also close to it in the sense that for my action guidance, right, I would be able to find my keys very easily. So in that sense, right, that's not something that can at all be captured by by this measure, right? Like there are a lot of cases where if the contents of my credences are such that they describe the world in a way that's close enough to what the world is actually like, it's going to be totally fine for my action guidance. But the creedal picture will actually judge me as being very inaccurate, because technically speaking, I'm very confident in a lot of propositions that are false. The other thing that's kind of a little bit dissatisfying about these accuracy measures, that because they're just these formal distance measures, they don't care about how we reach the truth, right? They judge accurate credences to be just as accurate if I've reached them by, carefully examining my evidence and thinking about it, or by just guessing, right? Because as long as the credences I land on are close to the truth, the framework is going to give me the summed up. So you might also think that leaves out something important. And also something that has recently been pointed out. So for example, Brian Talbot has written about this. If we actually think that the accuracy of some credences has like really no value at all, right? So for example, if you think that having accurate credences about people's phone numbers in New York City in the 50s is like absolutely valueless and a complete waste of your cognitive efforts, right? Then we can't use the accuracy framework to prove all these great results about why it's important to have coherent credences, because for those results to hold, we really have to think that there's like something important about getting these things right, but that might not actually match on how we in real life think about the value of having accurate credences or accurate beliefs, because you might think, yeah, that's really valuable if it's about things that are important, but if it's about things that are absolutely unimportant, right, then it might just be completely valueless and a waste of your time. And that is something that these frameworks are not very well equipped to capture. Okay, so thank you very much.
So let us continue. Ted, would you give the next comment?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So it's a real pleasure to be a part of this session on Julia's excellent book. So during the pandemic, I was looking for ways to connect with my colleagues because we were, of course, not on campus, and I organized a reading group on Julia's book, and it was a really excellent book to do a reading group on. There were a lot of really interesting conversations we had, so many fascinating arguments in this book, and so it's a real pleasure to work through her book again. I enjoyed it the first time, and I enjoyed it even more reading it the second time. So what I want to do is just think about the issue of evidence and how that fits in with some of these Bayesian norms that Julia talks about. So I want to start off by just giving a brief overview of the project sort of as I see it. So as Julia noted in her comments, right, we start off with this idea that these Bayesian norms of rationality are ideals, and they're rather unrealistic. So one specific norm is the norm of probabilism, which says that a subject's credences should be representable by a probability function, right? And if they have an attitude in a tautology at all, right, that attitude should be one of full credence. And this is unrealistic. Some tautologies are very difficult. Some people haven't thought about them, right? But even if you consider them, right, it can seem difficult to know if it's true or not. Yet, even though these are ideals, Bayesians often talk about, well, look, it would be better to approximate these ideals. Ehrman mentions this, for example, in his book, Bayes or Bust, and notices that no one has ever worked out like exactly why it would be better to approximate this idea. So Julia's project is really fascinating and needed one to try to formally work out like how we understand closeness to the ideal and why it would be better. Right. So she defends the idea that these Bayesian norms are indeed relevant to normal human thinkers, right, as ideals worthy of approximation. We now have a formal way of representing closeness, and we also can see that having credences that are less incoherent achieves various things of value, achieves accuracy, and achieves better action guidingness. And along the way, she presents a really enriching and valuable discussion on Bayesian epistemology. So the chapter on Dutch book arguments, the chapter on accuracy-based arguments, I think is really fascinating. And then how it, in the later chapters, how that mixes with other Bayesian principles like the principle or the indifference principle. And one of the things that I really enjoy about the book is in the latter chapters, there's this more broader discussion of how these ideals will fit in with some of the ways people talk about rationality in more broad epistemology. And so that's kind of what I want to focus on. All right, so I want to ask the question, what's the role of evidence in Bayesian norms? And one of the things that I think is really great about this book is Julia is very sensitive to how considerations of evidence interact with Bayesian norms of rationality. And she offers a very novel way of thinking about one class of objections to Bayesianism. So this focuses on these norms, these Bayesian norms as being unrealistic. I'm going to focus on just this case where a subject ought to have full credence in any tautology. I mean, usually this is said in a way where if a subject has an attitude in a tautology, so they consider it, then they should have full credence in the tautology. So what Julia does is really, I think, interesting and novel is she takes the distinction between propositional rationality and doxastic rationality to say that, look, a subject has evidence that makes full credence in any tautology propositionally rational, right? So we'll look at a case right in a minute, but just think about this from a sort of a argumentative strategy. This is a really clever move. It's like, so people think, look, F is really unrealistic, perhaps it should be, taken as a serious problem with Bayesian norms of rationality. And Julia says, well, look, we can apply this distinction if a subject does have evidence, right, for a tautology that makes full credence proposition rational, then F is a lot more plausible, right? It's just sort of a case of these instance of these cases where a subject has evidence in their possession, right, that makes a belief rational, but they haven't reflected on their evidence, right? So that removes a lot of the a significant amount of worry that comes with F. Okay, so let's look at two cases. All right, so these are cases that Julia mentions in chapter 8 of her book. So this is on page 153. So there are two logic students, Una and Sarah. They're both working on the same problem. So Una, right, has this homework assignment and she needs to figure out where some premises entail some conclusion. Now, in fact, if P then C is tautological, but Una hasn't found the proof yet, right? She currently assigns the conditional middling credence of 0.5, right? Sarah, working on the same logic problem, right? Hasn't found a proof yet that P implies C, but she currently assigns the conditional credence of 1. All right. So I want to look at what Julia says about these cases, and then I want to offer some thoughts about that, and then sort of take a little bit of a broader perspective to try to figure out how this might bear on the larger project of thinking about norms of rationality within a Bayesian perspective. Okay, so this is on page 154. I realize it's a lot of text, but I think it's really interesting. So here's what Julia says about this case. So she starts off, says, from the perspective of propositional epistemic rationality, Sarah's credence is rational and Una's credence is irrational. So Sarah's the one who's certain, Una's the one with middling credence. Yet upon being presented with these cases, the more intuitive response for many people say that Una, right, is rational and Sarah is irrational. And it's easy to see why. Sarah's certainty is entirely baseless, whereas Una's uncertainty is appropriately cautious. So this type of intuition sometimes motivates people to question or reject the Bayesian view of rationality altogether, which is understandable given that there are not many proponents, given that not many proponents of Bayesianism explicitly distinguish doxastic from propositional rationality. But once we see the standard Bayesian requirements as requirements of propositional rationality, they're a lot less counterintuitive. So again, I think this is a really novel, interesting strategy to try to mitigate this kind of objection to Bayesian norms. So Julia continues, she says, what's propositionally rational for a thinker depends on what their evidence supports. If a claim is tautological and its truth can thus be determined without any empirical evidence, or alternatively, any thinker is in some sense already in possession of the needed evidence to determine its truth, then for any thinker, assigning this claim full credence is propositionally rational. So what we see here is the move that's sort of typically made with propositional rationality. It ties it to what evidence a person has at the time, right? And then say like, look, there's a sense in which if you have adequate evidence for a claim and you haven't sort of reflected on it yet, then, right, you're propositionally rational. You have, good reasons to believe that claim. So she continues, this is the case for both Una and Sarah. By contrast, an attitude is doxastically rational for a thinker, only if it's based in the right way on their reasons or evidence. Our intuition about whether a thinker has rational credences or beliefs often tracks this notion of rationality. We deem Sarah's certainty and if P then C irrational because it's not based on anything. It's irrational in this doxastic sense. All right. So I want to think a little bit about this. Here's a picture of a speckled hen, which will become clear while we're talking about speckled hens in a minute. All right, so there is an ambiguity in how we talk about evidence. So this is a point that Feldman and Connie make in their 2008 paper, Evidence, which is in Quentin Smith's epistemology volume. So on one way of talking about evidence, we can refer to something we talk about this in, like scientific evidence or legal evidence. Something is said to be evidence when it's a reliable indicator of some state in the world. So for example, think about fingerprints on a weapon, right? The fingerprints have a distinctive characteristic that would enable someone to pick out whose fingerprints they are. And so we would say, in a way, a detective who knows, right, that their fingerprints on a weapon, they have distinctive characteristics, that he has evidence, right, about who the murderer is, right? And suppose it's Jones's fingerprints, you might say, speaking in kind of this third person perspective, is that the detective has evidence, right, that Jones is the murderer, right? This is to sort of speak in this way you kind of talk about, scientific or legal evidence. But, right, from an epistemological perspective, we're interested in like, well, what should a person believe? What do they have reason to believe? Right? There's a sense in which, the detective doesn't have any evidence, right, that Jones is the murderer, because the detective, even though they know, right, that their fingerprints on a weapon and those fingerprints have distinctive characteristics, the detective doesn't know, right, the connection between those distinctive characteristics of those fingerprints and the fact that they're Jones's fingerprints. So Feldman and Connie, I think this is right, says, look, in addition, right, what's required for having evidence in the sense that's relevant for, an evidentialist account of justification is to say, it's not enough to know information that's reliably connected to other states in the world. You have to know the relevant connection. Okay. So this is a point that I think fits in with a broader class of cases in traditional epistemology. So A.J. Ayer raised this problem, raised what's called the speckled hen problem to certain empiricist views of perceptual justification. And then Chisholm in the early 40s wrote an article, famous article called The Problem of the Speckled Hen. And so the basic problem is this, is like you can be in a perceptual state that is reliably correlated with other states in the world that in fact, in some sense or another, put you in direct contact with a relevant fact and yet not have evidence for that relevant fact. So we see here this picture of a speckled hen, and we're going to suppose that it has a determinate number of speckles, and it's not the best picture, but you can make this point with, arrayed dots if you want to. But suppose it has a determinate number of speckles, those number of speckles 49, right? You're looking right at it, right? And unless you count the actual dots, right, you don't have any reason to believe that the hen has 49 speckles, right? And so Ayer makes this point. He's like, look, you could be in a perceptual state, right, that in some sense or another includes as information a very determinate fact, but you don't have as evidence that determinate fact unless you notice it, unless you sort of count the speckles. Okay, so when we're thinking about what it is to possess evidence, right, in the sense that's relevant to determine what should a person believe, right, it's not enough that they know information that somehow or another, right, is related to some other fact, right? They have to be able to notice or work out what that other fact is, right? So how does this, whoops. Yeah, here we are. Okay, so what lessons can we draw from this case? And, again, I think Julia's discussion here is excellent. There's a class of cases here that I think, that she's definitely interested in that a lot of people haven't talked about. So what she says is that Una's case belongs to a more general class of cases in which a thinker has not yet had a chance to examine her evidence or to reason through a problem carefully, and thus adopts a non-committal attitude in light of this. And what I want to do is I want to just separate out those kinds of cases, the sort of two thoughts, right, where a thinker might have evidence but hasn't thought about what the evidence supports, right, from this other thing where you have information, right, that you haven't worked out what the relevant connections are. Right? Julia mentions another case by Sinan Dagramachi, which is the case of where you have a 1/10 credence that the trillionth digit of pi is 2. I don't know why you need the trillionth digit of pi. You could just do the 100th digit of pi, but that seems entirely appropriate. Julia's read, as I understand it on this case, right, is that it belongs to the same sort of series of cases in which the subject hasn't evaluated their evidence, right? In all these cases, I want to say the subject just doesn't have, right, in these, what I'm going to call to be determined cases, doesn't have relevant evidence, right? So in terms of the larger picture here, is Julia wants to defend these norms of probabilism, right, as norms of propositional rationality and tie that, right, to what evidence an agent has at the time. And so what I want to do is I want to actually suggest a different way of understanding these norms. And make sure this shows up. So, and then tie this into some thoughts that Julia has about the connection between evaluative assessments and guidance that she's interested in the chapter 8. So I really like Paul Horwich's article, Wittgensteinian Bayesianism, which thinks of Bayesianism as a modeling tool, right, that can be useful for certain situations and maybe not useful for others. So maybe a different way of thinking about norms of probabilism is that they're norms for good models, right? And, as we know, models are applicable to certain situations, but not to others, right? So in these to be determined kinds of cases, the subject just lacks what the relevant evidence is. And so the norms of probabilism there aren't going to be relevant for evaluative assessments in those kinds of cases. But I do think, there might be a way, if we're thinking of norms of probabilism as norms of good models, there might be a way of using them as evaluative assessments and using them as guidance, right? So, probabilistic models, right, give you like definite instructions on how you're going to construct the model, and it helps you, right, tease apart subtle connections between evidence that you might not otherwise have noticed. So, for example, I think one interesting case of doing this is Jacobs Deganga. He has this book, Medical Nihilism, which came out a couple years ago, and he offers like Bayesian models for why we should be suspicious of apparently good evidence that a medical intervention is going to be effective, right? And we were working through this the other day in class, and it's just a very helpful way for people to realize, given the way drug companies benefit from successful drugs, and given the way they select, participants to be a part of the study, right? And given some of the, other relevant medical facts, it's very, likely that they come up with misleading, spurious evidence. So this is a case where you can use a model, right? And it's helpful to generate, right, evidence. And then that is helpful for generating, for understanding the value of assessments. So that's the sort of the point I wanted to make. I did want to just close with what I thought is just an excellent feature of Julia's book, is that in the latter part of the book, she's really interested in how these formal ways of thinking about rationality fit with this broader perspective in epistemology. And I think that's entirely laudable. So it's an excellent model for a book that makes a solid contribution in Bayesian epistemology that's applicable to a much wider range of thinking about these issues in rationality. So thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Julia, I guess you want to respond, right?
Yes, yeah. Thank you so much for these really great comments and for all the nice words about the book. So I think that Ted has really latched on to some really important issues that are really not solved yet and need a lot more discussion. And the Una and Sarah case is actually also the case that I started kind of thinking about more after I was done with the book. And I've recently written actually a series of papers that basically all start from the Una and Sarah case. So I'm very excited to think about this more. So let's think a little bit about how Bayesian models treat evidence, right? So when you have a Bayesian model, it will assume that any new evidence that is learned is immediately incorporated into one's credences, right? We have this conditionalization norm and it says, yeah, you sort of like become certain of that thing and then your credences just boom, update. And also the models assume logical infallibility, right? So that as soon as you have an opinion about any logical truth or falsehood, you should immediately have the credence that reflects whether it's a truth or a falsehood or whatever, right? And so once we have kind of this this insight into how evidence is treated by the models, we realize, right, that this is obviously not at all how real people reason, right? Because a lot of the time, we need some time to think through the significance of something that we've learned, right? We're slow in updating, especially when what we learn is actually not super straightforward. And I think that this is really kind of a thing that gets neglected in a lot of the literature on reasoning, because a lot of the literature on reasoning and philosophy basically says, let's start with the simplest case and figure out how that works. And the simplest case is often, like a simple modus ponens inference or something like that, which I think is usually pretty immediate, but that sort of neglects how complicated it actually gets when we reason about things where we have to aggregate large bodies of evidence, or we have to like go through a lot of steps, right? And I think that that's really interesting, and that is like something that really hasn't been talked about enough. And obviously, like as a real human thinker, we can figure out the answers to many logical and mathematical questions a priori, right? There's a lot of math and logic that is not that difficult that we can figure out with a little bit of thought. But again, right, we don't already know the answers. And it seems strange to say that, right, there's some irrational thing about me just because it's going to take me a minute or two to, do some addition or subtraction, right? It seems strange to think that that's an irrational feature of me. So then, Ted wants to say that in those kinds of cases, right, where I haven't really figured out yet what my evidence supports or what the answer is to some like logic question or math question, that I just don't have the evidence yet. And so this is a view, right, on which reasoning either about empirical or about a priori matters would actually generate evidence. And I've thought a little bit about this view, and I don't like it that much. I think that, first of all, just coming from an intuitive point of view, I think there is a clear sense in which I can have evidence for something, even if I haven't worked out its significance yet, right? So, for example, think about the famous lunch bill case, right, that the people who think about higher order evidence think about a lot. I know that, the lunch bill is a certain amount. I know that we're going to split it with 20% tip. right? And so I have all the information I need in order to figure out how much we each owe. It's just going to take me a couple of minutes to actually work out the math, right? So in that case, or in that type of case, I think that it is very intuitive to say that I have all the evidence that I need in order to figure out, what the lunch bill amounts to for each of us. And I'm not sure that it's intuitive in that case to say, no, I'm lacking some evidence in order to know how much we each owe. But suppose we did say that in those kinds of cases, right? My reasoning, where I'm actually working out the math or I'm doing the logic proof or whatever, that this kind of reasoning generates evidence that I didn't have before, so that only once I generate the evidence do I have sort of what I need to support my conclusion. I think that kind of view actually makes kind of wonky predictions about when we can terminate reasoning processes. Because I think it's a very reasonable thing to think that when you've worked out what the significance of your current total evidence is, that's a good stopping point for reasoning and for forming a conclusion, right? But if in those kinds of cases where you haven't, figured out how much you each owe for lunch, or where you haven't figured out, in the detective case, like, what your evidence actually supports about who killed, the victim or whatever, I think in those kinds of cases, we want to say that there's somehow, right, rational pressure to figure out what your evidence supports, so that you can only, have sort of a rational landing point or a rational conclusion once you've kind of put your evidence together in a sense, or worked out what it supports. But if on this view on which reasoning generates evidence, right, in a way you could just, stop at your current stage where you haven't worked out the answer yet, because in a sense that is the rational response to the total evidence you have at that point. And so that kind of drives me to say that whatever it is that reasoning generates, it's not just additional evidence that is of the same type as some kind of empirical evidence that you might learn in addition. Just because I think if we think about it that way, yeah, we have we arrive at sort of like implausible views about when you've appropriately considered your total evidence, when you can stop reasoning and things like that. And I don't think that's a knockdown argument. I think it's just like, we can generate a more elegant view or a more plausible view, I think, that fits with more of our intuitions when we don't say that reasoning generates additional evidence that's of the same type as evidence we might just learn from, doing more research or something like that. The view I prefer is that reasoning generates something else. It generates what I might call insight into what our evidence supports. But this kind of insight is not the same thing as just more pieces of evidence. And then what I want to argue is that the attitudes that are rational for us while our reasoning is still in progress, right? Sort of, for example, what's rational for Una while she's doing her logic proof, those attitudes are rational in a different way from how the attitudes are rational that are appropriate conclusions of our reasoning, right? And I think that that's true even if we say that our evidence stays the same, right? So I have a little bit of work on that that's recently been published. So there's one paper that's called Pro Tem Rationality, where I try to spell out this idea that we have one standard of rationality that tells us what a rational conclusion of our evidence, of our reasoning is, and that is somehow sensitive more to our total evidence. And then there's a different standard of rationality that applies to attitudes that we form kind of while we're working through our evidence and generating this kind of insight. And I say that those attitudes are rational, not relative to our total evidence, but just to what we've considered that far into sort of the level of insight that we've been able to achieve at that stage of our reasoning. And I think that this is how we should ultimately deal with these Una and Sarah cases. I think it's ultimately not enough to just appeal to the distinction between propositional and doxastic rationality to explain why we have these intuitions about Una being rational with her middling credence and Sarah being irrational with her high credence. I think in the end, we need to both think about, right, how do we distinguish between rational doxastically rational credences and propositionally rational credences. But we also have to bring into the mix this distinction between rationality standards for conclusions of reasoning and rationality standards for what I call these transitional attitudes that we form while we're still working our way through our evidence and we're trying to figure out what it supports. But I think that this is a super interesting debate that's really still in progress. And while this is kind of the view that I favor, I definitely also see the appeal of the view that Ted is proposing, because I think it also, it is elegant in a certain way in that it just kind of like treats, evidence as this sort of very general category that you can get in many different ways, right? Either by learning about the external world or by, thinking about something more. But I think, ultimately, of course, I'm hoping that I can argue that my version of thinking about it is better, but I do think that that is not an easy thing to do. So thank you so much for these thoughts.
Thank you. So now we come to our last comment. Liz, are you ready? Okay, the stage is yours.
So I just wanted to, again, like other people said, well, first of all, I've learned a lot already. This has been really awesome and interesting. But I wanted to thank Sibel and Concept for having me, and especially just thank Julia for this book. I read this book very closely. Actually, I wrote kind of a longer, more substantive commentary for analysis. It's like called a critical notice, but I really enjoyed the book. I highly recommend it. I found a lot of it quite compelling. And just for the sake of time, I'm really going to kind of narrowly focus on one chapter, but there's so much good stuff in here, and there's so much stuff that I could be talking about. But for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay, if I can make the slide move. Okay, sorry, technical stuff. Okay, so I'm going to focus on chapter 9, which sort of addresses the question about how beliefs simplify reasoning, and also the relationship between sort of flat out believing a proposition, treating it as true, versus having some credence in a proposition that's a more uncertain attitude. Oops, sorry. Okay, so in this chapter, Julia addresses the question of why we would have outright beliefs, which Julia is taking to be attitudes that don't encode uncertainty, in addition to credences, which are attitudes that do encode uncertainty. And Julia really focuses on one particular answer to this question, which is the simplifying view of belief, or the simplifying answer to this question. And that's the view that outright beliefs simplify our reasoning process by allowing us to disregard small probabilities of error. So one example, actually, interestingly, a lot of the sort of pragmatic encroachment examples I think fit here well. One example, which I think is inspired by a case from Keith DeRose, actually, that I've given to illustrate this, is an example of, so let's say you go to the office one day, and in grad school, I shared an office with someone named Rachel. And let's just say you go into the office and you see Rachel's coat and backpack. And then maybe my friend Sam casually asks me, is Rachel in today? I say, yeah, I saw Rachel's coat and backpack. So in that situation, I think it makes sense to sort of disregard the possibility that Rachel actually isn't in today, but maybe her coat and backpack were there overnight, and just sort of treat it as true. But if the stakes get really high and maybe they're investigating a murder that happened on campus or something, then instead of just treating it as true that Rachel was in today, if the police are interviewing me about who I saw on campus that day, I'll say, well, look, I saw Rachel's coat and backpack, but I'm not 100% sure she was there. I didn't actually see her there. And so what this sort of example shows is that in some contexts, we can rely on our belief that something is true. In another context, we might rely instead on our credence that something is true. And again, when we rely on our belief, that basically treats the proposition as true. It doesn't encode uncertainty in any way. Whereas if we rely on our credence, then we sort of acknowledge that this proposition isn't totally certain, and because credences are sort of more fine-grained and enable us to do this. And the chapter does talk a lot about what Julia calls pseudo-conditionalization, which is a view about how we manage these switches between beliefs and credences. And Julia argues that pseudo-conditionalization is too complex for humans to, in fact, use. And then also for a normative claim, which is that because it's so complex, it would actually interfere with the function of belief, the simplifying function of belief. And so we should reject pseudo-conditionalization both normatively and descriptively. And I actually find that point relatively compelling. However, I want to sort of step back and actually just think about, why might we have both beliefs and credences? And what is this role that belief might play? This is just a question that I think I've been super interested in. A lot of my dissertation was about this. A lot of my work has been about this. And I'm really interested in sort of thinking about the roles that belief might play and the roles that credence might play. So as Julia mentioned, this question is often called the Bayesian challenge, which is the question of, why would we have outright beliefs in addition to credences? Credences seem to be more accurate. They can, do better with like preface and lottery cases. So why posit beliefs at all, especially if we can, have beliefs and credences towards the same propositions? And one way that Staffel motivates the simplifying answer to the Bayesian challenge, namely that beliefs simplify reasoning by ruling out these error possibilities in a way that credences cannot, is by sort of considering but then rejecting two other answers to the Bayesian challenge. So considering and rejecting other potential roles that belief might play that credences can't. So what I want to do is kind of talk a little bit about each of those roles and maybe give just some thoughts about why I'm still at least open to those maybe potentially being roles that belief might play. And then I also am going to close with just kind of 3 questions that I have about the simplifying role of belief that I think are interesting to discuss more. So the first role that Julia considers but then ultimately rejects is this view that beliefs play a role in knowledge and credences cannot play this role. And the thought is that a full belief, plus justification, plus not being get-eared, plus truth, whatever, that's what gives us knowledge. And then knowledge is uniquely valuable, but you can't just like substitute a credence in for the belief and sort of get knowledge in the same way. Sarah Moss has sort of famously challenged that beliefs play this role uniquely, and her views on probabilistic knowledge are views on which credences could be knowledge, or at least knowledge-like. But if you're not convinced by that, you might think this role in knowledge is a role that flat-out beliefs play that credences cannot. Okay, so recall though, Staffel's response to this is the following. The way that Staffel understands the distinctions between beliefs and credences is beliefs are things that don't encode uncertainty at all, whereas credences are things that do encode uncertainty. And because Staffel's sort of dividing up the territory this way, the thought is that take a belief in a probability. You believe that there's a 0.5 probability that the coin will land heads or something. Uncontroversially, a belief in a probability can amount to knowledge. And because of sort of the way where, she initially sets up this distinction between belief and credence, then credences actually can play a role in knowledge, at the very least via probability beliefs, because those encode uncertainty. So I think the reason that Julia is kind of dividing up the territory this way, encoding uncertainty versus not, is because Julia is interested in the distinction between simplifying attitudes, those that don't encode uncertainty, and then accuracy attitudes, those that do encode uncertainty. And I totally get that. I'm just worried that this way of dividing things up kind of seems to presuppose what's at issue. So the reason that you would divide things up in this way is because you're thinking, well, maybe beliefs play this special simplifying role, credences don't, and then it would make sense to divide it up this way. But if we're not kind of presupposing that, I guess it's not clear to me that this would be the right way to distinguish beliefs and credences. I mean, I agree with Julia that beliefs and probabilities may not simplify reasoning, although I suppose they would relative to like a credence about a probability, which starts to get quite complex, right? But if we're not presupposing the simplifying role of belief, if that's kind of what's at issue, then I'm wondering if we might have reason to question this way of demarcating beliefs and credences, and instead say, well, we have credences on the one hand. Credences are, complex attitude with a simple content. So you might have a 0.9 credence in P. P is the content, right? Whereas with beliefs, the beliefs would be, so the beliefs in the attitude, it doesn't encode any kind of uncertainty, but you can have beliefs towards bare propositions, or you can have beliefs towards probabilistic propositions where that probability is precise or that probability is imprecise or whatever. So yeah, I'm still interested in this, not totally convinced whether beliefs do play this role in knowledge that credences can't, but I just thought there was at least a little bit of room to push back there. Okay, the second role that Julia talks about that beliefs might play instead of simplifying reasoning is that beliefs play a role in our moral judgments that credences cannot. So some people might be familiar with Laura Bushak's view. Laura is one of the main people that argues for this. And basically what Laura argues is that high credence or high confidence that someone committed a crime is not an appropriate basis to believe that they're guilty or to blame them for guilt. And one of the main ways that Laura kind of argues for this is by considering cases where we have strong statistical evidence that someone did something, committed some crime, which might raise our credence even quite high that they're guilty. But that's not a basis for believing they're guilty or much less blaming them or convicting them. So Laura has this cell phone case where you leave your cell phone on the table and you come back and either Jake or Barbara stole your phone. Maybe they were the only two people in the vicinity that could have plausibly stolen it. And this is a made up statistic, but men are 10 times more likely to steal cell phones than women. You might have a 0.91 credence that Jake stole the phone, but you shouldn't believe Jake stole the phone. You shouldn't blame Jake. You shouldn't convict Jake or anything like that. So Staffel's response to this is really interesting. Staffel's response is that high confidence based on non-statistical evidence, by contrast, does seem to be an appropriate basis for blame. So we can actually blame people based on a high credence. It just can't be based on statistical evidence. So, a second example would be a 90% reliable eyewitness says that they saw Jake steal the phone. This seems like a much more appropriate basis to believe Jake did it or to, even blame, convict Jake or whatever. So if we can blame people on the basis of high confidence, then it doesn't really seem like this is a plausible role that beliefs would play. It's a simpler view. All we have to do is appeal to credences, and it sort of cuts out outright belief as the middleman. Okay, so this is an interesting question, and I've been thinking about this actually since I read the book. And I guess what my current thoughts on it are like, I think this might depend on the type of simplicity that we're interested in. So on Staffel's suggested view, it does get us a certain kind of simplicity because it dispenses with belief and is basically like, look, high credence can play this role. But I'm worried that it's adding complexity in another way. So here's Staffel's view, or at least potentially. We can blame someone based on a credence, but only if that credence is based on both the right kind of evidence and an adequate degree of evidence. So one is because you can't blame someone just based on statistical evidence. Maybe we want to include other kinds of evidence in there as well, but at least statistical evidence wouldn't be the right kind of evidence to blame someone. But also we need an adequate degree of evidence. What that degree is complicated, and there's different legal standards that people appeal to, probably at least above 0.5. We can, there's a lot of questions there, right? However, Bushak's view is the view that beliefs are the states that enable us to rightfully blame. And yeah, this is adding a role, this is adding an extra attitude in, and in that sense, it's more complex. But there is something that's kind of simple and clean about this. We don't have to be thinking about kinds of evidence or adequate degrees of evidence. It's just that when we have justification to believe someone did it, then that's the kind of thing that can enable us to blame someone. And I guess second, although related point here is that it's not totally clear that the view on which we can blame someone based on credences can capture this idea that we do tend to take a stand on someone's guilt. And this is a lot of what Bouchak pushes in that paper. It doesn't seem like we're doing something that involves as much uncertainty as the credence-only view would require. So Bouchak considers this idea, I mean, of course, you don't have to commit to this, but you might multiply your credence that they're guilty times the badness of the act that they may have committed and then blame them in proportion. And Bouchak's like, no, we don't do that. We decide whether they're guilty or innocent and then blame them in proportion to how bad the act is. It's not like if we have a 0.2 credence that someone murdered someone, we would blame them as much as a 0.999 credence someone stole a candy bar. I mean, maybe those aren't quite proportional, but hopefully you get the idea. We tend to take a stand on whether someone's guilty and then blame them in proportion to how bad the act is. So it's not clear that Julia's view can capture that. I mean, maybe, I guess you could reject that as a datum, but it does seem kind of plausible to me. So those are at least some potential responses on the reasons that Julia rejects two of the roles considered in chapter 9. Now I'm going to try to go quickly and just talk about 3 questions that I have about this simplifying role of belief. Okay, so my first question is, why belief and not acceptance? Accepting a proposition is treating that proposition as true, often for a practical purpose. And maybe in the cases in question where we think that the belief is the thing that's playing the simplifying role, what we're actually doing is just kind of accepting the proposition and treating it as true in our reasoning because it just makes our reasoning so much easier. And this does kind of seem like a pragmatic thing. I mean, it's really motivated by making our reasoning easier so we don't have to consider all these error possibilities. And so what we're doing is we're accepting these propositions. It makes our reasoning easier, but then the only really like epistemic attitude we have is credence, or if we have beliefs, they play a different role. I think this is kind of a tough question, or at least I find it challenging insofar as I'm tempted to the simplifying role of belief. So Staffel does address this question in a footnote, and I just want to briefly say something about the 2 responses in that footnote, which is footnote 5 of chapter 9. The first response is that acceptance, treating some proposition as true, is under our voluntary control, but beliefs, at least often, cannot be voluntarily adopted. But I guess this isn't totally clear to me, given the simplifying role of belief, because if the role of belief is to rule out error possibilities, I guess it wouldn't be clear that beliefs, at least in a lot of cases, it seems like we would have voluntary control over them. I think we can choose to discard possibilities in our reasoning. Someone might bring up some far-fetched possibility. Julia gave the example of planning a dinner party, and then someone's like, well, what if we all get sick next week? And you might just say, no, don't worry about that. Let's not think about that when we're planning this party. That's like a little bit paranoid, right? So you discard that possibility in your reasoning. And I think that does seem like something that's relatively voluntary, something that we can choose to do. Of course, we do have automatic dispositions to believe or accept things in certain contexts. I just think like if we want, we can kind of step back and either bring in new possibilities or disregard other possibilities. So in the same way that every night before I go to bed, I do have a disposition to brush my teeth, and often because it's so habitual, it just sort of happens automatically. That doesn't mean I can't step back and control whether I brush my teeth or make a decision to do it or not to do it. Okay, a little bit more on acceptance, and then 2 more questions. So the second response that Staffel gives about why not acceptance is that we accept low probability propositions, but we cannot believe low probability propositions. I guess you could also say, or we shouldn't believe low probability propositions. Maybe in certain cases of irrationality or double-mindedness, we can believe low probability propositions, but I think the response might work either way. So here's my thought on this. When you accept some proposition, you sort of round it up to 1, right? And acceptance might involve this large spectrum of kind of rounding up propositions at various probabilities for various practical purposes. And maybe what Staffel's doing is focusing on a subset of cases of rounding up when the proposition is antecedently probable. But I do think this kind of raises 2 questions. The first is, how improbable is too improbable? So yes, I agree we can accept low probability propositions, but like, where do we draw that threshold where like we might have certain cases where the proposition is just slightly above 0.5 or something. Like, could that count as a belief if we rule out that error possibility because maybe the stakes are just really low or something? So where do we draw that line? Where is it no longer a belief and does it turn into an acceptance? And you might also think too, like, both of these types of rounding, the high probability rounding and like middling or low probability rounding, they involve treating a proposition that's not certain as true for a practical purpose. And so there's something more cleaner and unified about just saying, look, these are all cases of acceptance. So this kind of brings this like new version of the Bayesian challenge, I guess you could say, which is why posit beliefs in addition to acceptances? So one thing I think is important is that a lot of people think beliefs are representational. So when I believe P, I represent the world mentally such that P. And I'm wondering if maybe a kind of a friendly suggestion of why not acceptance is that maybe when we believe something, we are rounding it up, but that involves this mental representational component where we're mentally treating P as true, not just acting as if P. So acceptances are this much thinner thing, this policy to act. Whereas when we form a belief, and then especially when we're relying on that in a context, we're sort of treating it mentally as true. We're representing the world. You know, you're representing the dinner party such that like you're healthy or whatever. Just a thought. I don't know if, you know, Julie wants to take that on board or not, but just a thought I had. Okay, 2 more questions and then I'll wrap up. Question number 2 is, given the simplifying role of belief, would cognitively ideal agents have beliefs? Of course, this depends on what we mean by cognitively ideal. Let's just go maximal. Consider God. God's omniscient. God has infinite cognitive resources, right? If we don't go in for the simplifying role of belief, but we have beliefs for some other reason, like to know things, to take a stand on certain propositions, or for moral judgments, then I think it's a lot more plausible that God would have beliefs, because God would want to have mental states that would play roles like these. But if beliefs are just there to rule out error possibilities, and they do lead to these, you know, small amounts of incoherence, is the suggestion that a being like God would only have credences, and then maybe like the more we cognitively ramp up, the less beliefs those agents would have? I don't know. I'm not necessarily saying this is a reductio of the simplifying view, but it does kind of seem to suggest that beliefs are basically just a heuristic that we have due to our limitations. And I can at least feel the pull of wanting to have a more robust role for beliefs than that. I think some people will say, no, that makes total sense. I don't really care about giving beliefs a more robust role. It's fine if cognitively ideal agents don't have beliefs. But I think other people might say, well, you know, like, it doesn't just seem like beliefs are this like heuristic that we just use because we can't consider all the possibilities in our reasoning. Like, we want to say that beliefs are more important than that. They play some kind of central epistemic role, not just because we're cognitively limited agents. So I definitely, on certain days of the week, feel the pull of that. Okay, my final question I'll talk about briefly is, what about other roles for belief? So there's even additional roles for belief that beliefs might play that credences can't. Here's a couple examples. So Rosh and Schroeder in their 2014 paper, Belief, Credence, and Pragmatic Encroachment, talk about a couple. Beliefs allow us to take a stand on whether P. Unclear that non-extreme credences can let us take a stand in the same way. Beliefs let us have a view of the world, so they allow us to view or represent the world such that P is flat out true. Again, not clear that non-extreme credences can play this role. Bouchak talks about a couple other potentially related views, but I think maybe partially distinct. Bouchak thinks that beliefs might play some kind of role in faith. And what they do is they basically allow us to maintain these important commitments or these important convictions, like about political, moral, or religious matters, even in light of counter evidence. So credences can kind of track our exact level of evidence and maybe help us determine when we should give up our beliefs at a certain point. But beliefs let us nonetheless take a stand on these maybe propositions that are at the core of the web of our belief. And Bouchak thinks this is closely related to this idea that faith could be rational, but in some sense go beyond the evidence. Bouchak also thinks that beliefs might play an interesting role in sort of carving this middle way between conciliationist and steadfast views and disagreement. So maybe, at least in light of some disagreements, we can remain steadfast with our beliefs. We don't have to be spineless. We can take a stand on our important convictions, even if they're controversial, but we shouldn't be overly or maybe even highly confident about those things. And so we should, to an extent, conciliate with our credences. So I think this is related to what I was saying earlier about beliefs being in some sense representational attitudes. So if beliefs function to let us represent certain things as true, whether that's trivial things like it will rain tomorrow, or more important things like your political or moral or religious views, I think a lot of these roles make a lot of sense. There's a lot of questions that I want to think more about here. Could belief play more than one role? Could beliefs play these roles and play the simplifying role? Or maybe do some of our beliefs play some of these roles and some of our beliefs play other roles? And then you might think, well, should we call them both beliefs, especially if we're trying to, individuate mental states by their functional roles? Maybe then there's just two different attitudes. And then that starts to push me more to acceptances simplify, whereas beliefs enable us to do things like take a stand or have a view. Yeah, so I think that's the end of my presentation, but thanks again, Julia, for an awesome book. Again, so much that I didn't get to talk about, but I really enjoyed it, and I'm honored to be a part of this panel as well.
Okay, thanks, Liz, for these really great comments and for your kind words about the book. You're asking me some really hard stuff about belief, and that I'm also still thinking about, so I'm going to give you some of my my thoughts, but yeah, I don't think I have like final answers to a lot of these things. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about why I demarcated beliefs and credences in the way I did, because as you're pointing out, this is not necessarily the same way it's always done in the literature, right? So what you might think is the standard way, or the way that is often adopted, is that belief is an on-off attitude that can have probabilistic or non-probabilistic content, right? So you could have, you could believe that the store is open until midnight, or you could believe that the store is probably open until midnight, and those are both beliefs on this view. Whereas credences have are attitudes where the attitude itself is graded, and again, they can also have probabilistic or non-probabilistic contents, right? So the difference is really about what's the structure of the attitude. Does the attitude have this like on-off structure, or does the attitude have this graded structure? And then they can have the same types of contents. The way I divide it up is I say that a belief or an outright belief is an attitude that treats something as true, whereas a credence is an attitude that encodes uncertainty. Why am I doing it this way? The reason why I'm doing it this way is because I think that only this way of demarcating beliefs and credences actually makes sense of the Bayesian challenge, right? Because the Bayesian challenge asks, why do we need beliefs, a coarse-grained attitude, in addition to credences, a more fine-grained attitude, right? Because if you go with the standard way of demarcating them, you can't really in the same way ask this question about why is it not redundant to have like a more coarse-grained version of your attitudes when you already have the fine-grained version? Because the fine-grained version could also be beliefs with probabilistic contents, right? And then you would like suppose you thought that all of our attitudes have this like on-off structure, right? Then you would have a version of the Bayesian challenge that says, if you have beliefs with these fine-grained probabilistic contents, why would you need in addition beliefs with these like simple contents? Like, if you already believe that the store is probably open, why would you still have to have a belief that the store is open, right? So in a way, it's about the relationship between having like a set of very fine-grained attitudes that seem like very like specific to what your evidence supports. And then this question of why have these coarse-grained attitudes kind of on top of that? Isn't that like extra stuff we don't need? Right. And so I think on my demarcation of belief and credence, it's just a simpler way of getting at that question. Okay, so now let's think about Bouchak's view, right? So Bouchak has sort of an alternative view about why we need beliefs in addition to credences. Now, right, so she says that we need beliefs to ground our assessments of like praise and blame. I say that we can use credences that are based on the right kind of evidence to praise and blame people. I mean, Liz was suggesting that maybe the belief view is simpler because then we don't have to talk about like what kind of evidence you have and stuff like that. But in a way we do, right? Because in a way, like this question comes up again when we ask, well, which of your beliefs are justified? Because then all the same things come up again, because then you have to say like, well, you shouldn't believe something just on statistical evidence. So I think I'm not convinced kind of by this idea that introducing the beliefs makes things simpler. It maybe just like hides some of the same issues. But I want to talk a bit more about this idea of whether the credences allow us to take a stand, right? Because maybe, yeah, you really need to like commit and take a stand on whether somebody did something in order to praise them or blame them. And I think it's right to point out that our credence is certainly not taking a stand, right? Our credence is not treating it as true that the person did the action that we're praising them for or blaming them for. But you might think that we can still take a stand in fully blaming or praising the person, right? So you might think, once I've reached a credence that's high enough and based on the right kind of evidence, and that I think it's appropriate for me to praise the person or blame the person, my taking a stand is actually expressed not in the credence, but in, you know, my assigning blame to the person or assigning praise. Because I think that what Liz was explaining, Bouchak says is exactly right. We're not proportioning the amount of blame or the amount of praise to how high our credence is. We apportion it to how bad the thing or how good the thing is that we think the person did, right? So the stand taking might just happen in the attitude where we're blaming or praising somebody. And I was thinking that there are other cases where it's similar. Like I was thinking about hope, for example, right? Most people think that for you to be able to hope for something in a rational way, you have to have positive credence that it could happen, right? If you think something is impossible, you can't really hope for it. But then, you know, when you hope for it to happen, that is sort of independent of how high your confidence is that it could happen, right? So if you, I don't know, if you hope to get a certain, you know, paper accepted or whatever, right? Your hope is just sort of taking a stand on what you want the world to be like, and that's not proportional to how confident you are that it might happen, right? Or there are other cases where, like, you know, once our credence is high enough that something could happen, we think that's, you know, good enough reason to act. Our act is not like graded in the way that tracks our credences. So in a way, I feel like there's a way of sort of salvaging this idea that praising and blaming involves taking a stand, even if the taking a stand is not happening in the epistemic attitude itself. Liz was also pressing me on the difference between belief and acceptance. And I think I'm pretty much in line with what other people say in the literature when I point out that the main differences are that we have more voluntary control over what we accept than over what we believe. Although I do agree that we have some degree of voluntary control over our beliefs. We just have more when it comes to acceptance. And I think that at least psychologically, it's easier for us to accept low probability claims. Whereas when things have really low probability, we don't usually add them into our sort of stock of beliefs. At least not in sort of typical cases. Like we usually just treat something as true if we think that it's like so likely that it doesn't matter if we rule out that sort of small error probability. But when we ask, well, is it important that we use beliefs to simplify reasoning rather than acceptances? Well, I mean, the formal structure would be the same, right? Like all the sort of formal arguments for why treating things as true makes things simpler than reasoning with credences. There, we don't see any difference between reasoning and reasoning with beliefs and reasoning with acceptances, right? The simplifying role they could in principle play is the same. So there must be some other reason why we might need beliefs rather than acceptances to simplify reasoning. It's not like a formal reason about how they would function, right? And while they do seem to differ in some of the ways we use them, right? I'm not totally convinced that that difference is super significant, right? I think ultimately, like, we have to ask really difficult questions here about how we should best categorize our mental states. And it might be that depending on how we draw the line between belief and acceptance, right? It's not going to be as clean as I'm saying, like, oh yeah, we use beliefs to simplify reasoning and that's their function. And then acceptance, yeah, what's the function of acceptance? Maybe also partially that. right? So I think this is getting us into really difficult territory here. I mean, in a way, like in the chapter, right, the Bayesian challenge was supposed to be about beliefs, like why have beliefs in addition to credences? And I think this is a plausible answer. But once we introduce this other alternative, like, oh, but couldn't it also be that acceptances play this role? I think, yeah, that's totally something that's on the table, and that I think the arguments I give in that chapter don't really adequately rule out that could also be an alternative view, right? The one thing I think is that depending on what your view of belief is, I mean, you can't always swap them out, right? Because I was thinking that for Bouchard's purposes, you really wouldn't necessarily want acceptances to play the roles that she thinks beliefs play, right? Because an acceptance doesn't seem like a very good basis for blaming and praising people if you can accept things voluntarily that have very low probability, right? That would be a bad basis for that. So at least if you like Bouchard's view, you shouldn't think that they can be swapped out so easily. But for the simplifying view, I think it's much more plausible that, they are sort of like competitors for playing the simplifying role. Now, what about the case of, ideal agents? Would they need beliefs? Well, I mean, I was thinking, well, would God have credences? Well, maybe God would be certain of everything. So in a sense, God has beliefs, right? If you have like credence 1 in something, that's basically the same as believing it, except that it's fully supported by your evidence, right? Rather than like, you're not jumping to sort of treating it as true. You're already there if you're God, right? So in a way, for God, I think it's kind of a weird question. But of course, we could think of cognitively unlimited agents who are not omniscient. And for them, I think we might say, yeah, they don't need them, right? Maybe if belief is just making things simple, maybe cognitively unlimited agents just have no use for beliefs. And I'm thinking, maybe that's not so bad, right? I mean, I think I can see like wanting belief to play a more robust role, especially because they've been such a prominent topic and, place on which attention was given all through the history of epistemology. But I don't know, maybe it's okay if we realize like, look, we focus on them so much because they are very central in our cognitive lives, because we are the sorts of agents that really make use of them a lot. But that was kind of like just, yeah, in a way, like an accident of our psychology. But if we thought about more like ideal reasoners and things like that, then we don't really, have to pay so much attention to them. But I think it's fine to say both they are just a simplifying heuristic, but a really important one because we use them so much because we need them. Like, I think that's not such a bad view to have. And I don't know, I think that's pretty attractive. That being said, I'm really not opposed to the view that beliefs could have multiple roles, right? I mean, I'm not sure why we should think that beliefs only do one thing, right? Or that, like for any sort of like feature we have that we sort of evolved to make use of, it seems kind of weird to think that that it has only one function, even if it could have like a main function or something like that, right? But I think we should definitely be open to this idea that beliefs can have multiple roles, but right then we have to always ask, like, is it really important that beliefs do these things, or could it be that these roles could also equally be played by something else, some other attitude that we have? And I think that should help us kind of make a little bit of progress on this. But yeah, I don't really have the final answers on this. I think these questions are super interesting, and I'm so glad that people are thinking with me about them. So yeah, thanks again, Liz, for those great comments. And thanks again for the invitation to present my research in this forum, and for people to like pay so much attention to my book and raise all these interesting questions. This was really fun. So yeah, thanks very much to everybody.
Thank you. Yeah, I would also like to thank everyone for your valuable contributions and for taking your time. And for our viewers, you can also talk to us by leaving us a comment in the comment section below. And if you want to stay tuned on the next episode of Philosopher Meets Critics or other events by Concept, you may visit our homepage, which I will link below. And of course, I will also leave a link to your book, Julia, so everyone can purchase it. Yeah, I hope you all enjoyed our discussion. I think it was very interesting, and I hope to see everyone soon. So take care. Bye.